What is happening, true believers? James Hancock here, back to review Spider-Man Homecoming, Spidey's first solo outing since getting a soft reboot in the film Captain America Civil War. I should say before I start this review, I'm going to keep it very spoiler-free initially, but before I give any specifics, I will give you more than enough warning so you can jump ship if you don't want any surprises of any kind ruined for you. I should also say that I am a hopeless Marvel zombie, just a complete, total, in-the-bag fanatic. I drink the Kool-Aid, I read the comics, I love the flicks, which obviously makes me a very biased viewer. So if you're looking for somebody who's a little less on their team, you probably won't find that review here because I'm a Marvel guy and have been since before I could read. The history of Spider-Man's been pretty interesting for the last 15 years or so because we've seen now 3 different iterations of the same character in a very short time span. Some of the movies are fondly remembered, some less so, and obviously Tom Holland's breakout phenomenal performance in Captain America Civil War definitely rebranded or made the character seem fresh and new again and got people very, very excited after several years where people were not so excited. I don't think anyone's going to say that Amazing Spider-Man or Amazing Spider-Man 2 are their favorite superhero movies, nor do any of us mourn the loss of the Spider-Man shared universe that Sony was planning at that time, although more to come on that toward the end of the review as we talk about Sony's future plans for the character. But for now, I'm just very, very excited to see everybody's friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, webhead, wall crawler, whatever you want to call him, back immersed in the MCU. And while the MCU is in this film, there are certain connections that you have seen from the trailers, like the presence of Iron Man, and there are a few other connections as well. And my hope is that audiences get so accustomed to Spidey being part of the MCU that there'll be riots in the streets if Sony and Marvel ever try to separate Spidey from where he belongs ever again. But this is a review of the film, not a review of the Marvel Universe overall, so I'll just say that Spider-Man Homecoming is a very, very solid film. It is not a home run superhero movie. Whatever your favorite superhero might be, whether it's The Dark Knight or Captain America Civil War, or if you like the rough stuff like Kick-Ass, but whatever your favorite superhero might be, Spider-Man Homecoming is probably not going to replace it. However, I should say, seeing this movie in Times Square on opening night with a New York crowd was the ideal way to see it because the crowd was very fired up to see a character that a lot of New Yorkers regard as their own. Spidey belongs to New York. He is born and raised in Queens. He is a New York guy, and the details in the comics and the movies in and about New York are always very, very important to the story for establishing the authenticity of the character. Marvel obviously has a shitload of characters based in New York, like the Man Without Fear, and Steve Rogers, who he's fighting here. I mean, all these guys, born and raised in New York. But there's something about Spider-Man just being a poor teen from Queens in high school dealing with relationship problems and money problems and all these crazy issues about trying to figure out who he is while at the same time facing people like the Vulture and Doc Ock and Scorpion. This has always made him a very, very endearing, heartwarming character to follow as a fan. What I really, really love about Spider-Man Homecoming is that this is a high school superhero movie. And back in the 60s when Stan Lee and Steve Ditko were basically inventing the character one issue at a time, Spider-Man was in high school for a very, very long time before we got to see him in college. And then when I was a kid, he was getting married to Mary Jane. And we got to see him slowly evolve and grow over several decades. And it was a fascinating saga to behold. But one of my criticisms of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man from 2002 was that we see him in high school for like 5 seconds before all of a sudden he's living in an apartment in New York and doing his thing. And we should definitely enjoy and appreciate and savor this part of Peter Parker's upbringing because this is where he figures out who Spider-Man is. And we see him making tons of mistakes, and we see him making awkward attempts at romance and all that good stuff. It boils down to the fact that Tom Holland was born to play Spider-Man. Tobey Maguire was fine, Andrew Garfield was fine. Tom Holland is Spider-Man because the kid's got no shortage of natural-born charisma, but he also is a natural gymnast. If you watch like his Facebook videos and that sort of thing, he can do the flips. He can do some crazy stunt work and some crazy shit. And so when you see him in his room crawling on the ceiling and in these awkward positions, it's great to have the actor doing it himself. It just makes him that much more believable. And personally, I would love to see Tom Holland play Spider-Man for many years to come. Another thing that's cool about seeing Tom Holland as Spider-Man is I feel like Tom Holland being thrust into the world of movie stars is very much like Spider-Man being thrust into the world of superheroes. Like, we saw this great picture from behind the scenes of Avengers Infinity War where Tom Holland is hanging out with Chris Pratt and Robert Downey Jr. and it's like, whoa, like there's a major star, there's a major star in the making, and here's this fresh-faced youth hanging with the big dogs, and it's a lot like what we see Spider-Man doing in Captain America Civil War, where you've got Cap and Iron Man and Black Widow and all these major badasses, and all of a sudden you have this 15-year-old kid who's worried about his algebra homework being thrust into the situation and wildly outperforming everybody's expectations about what he can do under pressure. But let's talk specifically about this film. So before I get into any spoilers or details, I'll just say Spider-Man Homecoming is a roaring, crowd-pleasing piece of entertainment. Nothing but smiles in the crowd. It may drag here and there, and it doesn't necessarily have like the epic, passionate sweep of something major like The Dark Knight or Captain America Civil War, which for me are kind of the two major benchmarks by which superhero movies are judged. That said, I would take a very, very solid, strong Spider-Man movie any day of the week, especially after the previous two films, or pretty much, I mean, Spider-Man 3, Amazing Spider-Man, and Amazing Spider-Man 2 weren't my favorite movies, so it's great to see Peter Parker back on very firm footing. So, last warning now, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I will be getting into some details that might taint or ruin the experience if you are spoiler conscious, so let's get into some specifics. For long-time Spider-Man fans, this flick has tons of little details that they're just gonna eat up. Little details like having the Shocker in this flick. One of the earliest Spider-Man comics I ever read, the Shocker showed up. And the Shocker was always a bit of a Z-grade villain for Spider-Man. He could just smack around and be on about his day. I like how they just took the color scheme of his outfit and applied it to, spoiler alert, two different characters who actually assume the moniker of the Shocker during this flick. There's a lot of other little details in there, like Mac Gargan popping up. Mac Gargan, I mean, he's the fucking Scorpion, who eventually became, I believe, the second person to go by the name Venom when he basically bought the outfit off of Eddie Brock, but I'd have to check to confirm that. He was not the first Venom, but he was definitely the first Scorpion. And when I was a little kid in the early 80s, they had this great series called Marvel Tales, which was reprints of old Marvel comics, and at the time they were reprinting all the old Stan Lee, Steve Ditko Spider-Man comics from the early 60s. Scorpion's always been one of my favorite villains, so I love seeing Mac Gargan pop up in two different scenes in this. But one of the big questions for every Marvel fan is, how is the villain? Because Marvel, as much as I love Marvel movies, Marvel has a less than stellar track record when it comes to compelling villains. There are not that many. I mean, Loki is pretty cool because Loki's appeared in a couple movies and now we're invested in Loki, but there are a lot of interchangeable or downright boring bad guys in Marvel flicks. And I would say Michael Keaton as the Vulture is better than average for Marvel villains. The costume looks fucking great, and I like how when he's out of costume, he essentially wears like a bomber jacket or a flight jacket that has this fluffy collar that looks a lot like the classic Vulture outfit. Quick flash fact, my oldest and most valuable comic that I own is a really beat up, shredded version of Amazing Spider-Man #2. If you look up whatever the value is, take my value down to about 1% of that because it's just absolutely wrecked and destroyed. But I've always been a little sentimental about the Vulture because he's old school as hell. I mean, Amazing Spider-Man #2, boom, there he was. And what's cool about his background is they tie it into the MCU, that he's basically working for the city. He's got a crew that's helping salvage all the wreckage after the events of Avengers from 2012, and they're picking up all the Chitauri technology and that sort of thing. And they're kicked off the job, but they sneak a little bit of it away, and they start developing their own hybrid technology involving Chitauri technology and Earthborn technology. And they start to make a very, very good living off of selling this technology. And then they start actually performing like heists and or scores, going after more supply, which is really cool, which brings them eventually into this great heist where they're going to try to actually steal a stash of weapons headed to the new Avengers headquarters that we've seen that's in upstate New York. There's little things like a new prototype for Cap's shield, and like a new suit for Iron Man. They even make a reference to Thor's belt, which is cool because Thor in the comics and in the mythology has this belt or a girdle he would whip out every once in a while that would triple his strength. Why that would just be like stashed as opposed to like in the safekeeping of the Valkyries or something like that is probably not something we want to look too deeply into. It's kind of a throwaway reference, but maybe we'll see that belt get whipped out in Thor Ragnarok in November, a movie that I'm intensely fired up to see. But the really cool thing about the Vulture in this is that in his regular civilian life, he is the father of the character Liz that Peter Parker has a crush on. Liz is played by Laura Harrier, I believe is how you'd say her name. I like it in the comics and in the movies when Peter Parker's friends have a connection to the villains, because when back in the 60s and 70s, it was always cool that Spider-Man's best friend, Harry, his father was Norman Osborn, who was the Green Goblin, which created this interesting dynamic, which was exploited pretty well in the Sam Raimi movies. And here we have a situation where he's conflicted because this girl that he's completely, totally in love with, her father's this crazy, murderous criminal who's threatening his life. It introduces some internal conflict to match Spider-Man's external conflict, which is always the ingredients for a great drama. You don't want just pure external conflict because then it's just superficial action. And you don't want pure internal conflict because then you have somebody looking at their navel and complaining the whole time. You need a nice mix of the two, and this film definitely does that. More great details for Spider-Man fans are just the way he conducts himself or the way he hangs out. Little things like being perched on a building with his mask pulled up as he's eating a sandwich. It's very mundane, but New York is full of bodegas, these little street corner grocery stores where you have these awesome delicatessens. And for someone on a budget, that is by far the best way to get a satisfactory meal. So those little shots are very classic Spidey. Or little things like making hammocks with his webs. We get a lot more playfulness with the webs, especially because the Tony Stark technology in his suit allows him to do interesting things like create web hand grenades and things like that. There's a whole wide range of things that he starts to experiment with, which is also very, very true to the comics, where in the 70s and 80s especially, he would make a lot of kind of it was almost like Green Lantern with his ring at times, making weapons and that sort of thing. The webs are not just for webbing people up and swinging. He uses them for a variety of purposes. One mild criticism I have, there are times where Spider-Man's suit starts to drift into becoming Iron Man light, and Spider-Man and Iron Man should always have very different identities. In the comic series by Mark Millar, Civil War, for a brief time, Spider-Man did have this crazy high-tech suit that had a very different look with these like spider legs that had a bunch of new tricks that Iron Man had provided for him. But I like it when Spider-Man only has a few bells and whistles on his suit. He shouldn't have Iron Man's full array of possibilities. And they skirt the line of drifting too far into that because at one point Spider-Man's buddy figures out a way to turn off the training wheel setting on his suit, which unlocks a bunch of new potential. So essentially he's talking to his version of Jarvis and learning all these things that his suit can do. That said, they don't go too far into that, and they ground the character again by putting him back in the most basic suit possible at the end, so we get some nice contrast there. So this is one of those movies that I feel like is very solid from start to finish, but the one thing it lacks is the big, soaring, emotional moment where your heart just goes out to the character or you get swept away by the experience. That's kind of an unfair criticism to say, well, you didn't completely blow me away. But the reality is, the best superhero movies do have that. Even something like in Spider-Man 2 back in 2004, the opening credits, when you have the beautiful Spider-Man theme music combined with the Alex Ross paintings during the credits, and when you hear that classic Spider-Man theme music, I remember getting goosebumps all over watching that at the time. Granted, those early 2000 superhero movies don't age very, very well, but at the time, it did have that sense of passion that really makes a Spider-Man story endearing. But there is one scene that comes very close, and it's taken almost directly from the comics. Way, way back in Spider-Man 33, we had this great bit where Spider-Man's trapped under all this metal with water coming down on him, and he's essentially given up, and he's just sitting there, and he's demoralized, but then he starts to think about, what is Aunt May going to do without him? And what's going to happen in his absence? And he rises to the occasion and pushes all the metal up and off of him. And it's one of those big, huge emotional climaxes that made Spider-Man one of the coolest comics of the 1960s. And we get a scene in this movie that is a very strong echo of that. So clearly the writing staff and or the director, John Watts, have done their homework. And I like it when you see people go back to the basics and figure out, what are the fundamental ingredients that make these characters tick? Why do these characters have such longevity? Why are they so relevant for so many decades in a row? Figuring out and isolating those moments or those ingredients, and then trying to find a way to put a fresh coat of paint on them and make them fresh and new and relevant again in 2017. So huge high five to the filmmakers for that insider's wink to the longtime Spider-Man fanatics. As much as this movie is a movie made for the mass audience, you can tell they very clearly wanted to make Spider-Man fans very happy. And I think most Spider-Man fans are going to walk out of this soaring. The characters they want to see are there. The moments they want to see are there. It feels like Spider-Man. It looks like Spider-Man. And all the stuff that was unendurably awful from Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2, they're all thankfully absent. What's crazy, Amazing Spider-Man number 2 only came out a couple of years ago. Like it's still relatively fresh in people's minds. It's amazing how quickly Marvel and Sony have done a complete and total course correction and realized we're going the wrong way. Let's fix this. like I said at the beginning of the video, my hope is that people will become so in love with the idea of Spider-Man being part of the MCU that Sony and Disney, essentially, aka Marvel, will come up with a long-term viable strategy that makes both studios happy on how to use these characters. Because obviously, Kevin Feige is a brilliant man who's run Marvel Studios very, very well since basically Iron Man in 2008, and he really gets to make these characters work. But Sony also wants to protect their intellectual property because they licensed this character forever ago and they want to make money. But I feel like there is a middle ground where Sony can still make money and Marvel can make great movies with this character that everybody knows and loves. But it'll be very interesting to see what happens because it's a very, very complicated legal puzzle with a ton of money on the line. And some fans are very well informed about these things and some fans are less so. But for the fans who are informed, it's just very, very important for us to constantly talk about how much we love Marvel and Sony working together. And before I wrap up, I will say this, and this is a major colossal spoiler. There is a fantastic scene at the very end where essentially Spider-Man is invited to join the Avengers, and he ends up turning them down, but we get a great shot of Gwyneth Paltrow as Pepper. She's back on the scene, which is great. So I love all these connective through lines. But the big question is, where does this movie rank relative to other Marvel movies? Maybe it's easier to rank it next to other Spider-Man movies before I rank it next to other Marvel movies. I haven't watched the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies in a long time, so it's probably not fair to draw a comparison because my memories of Spider-Man 1 and 2 are still very much from the early 2000s, where our expectations from superhero movies were much diminished relative to where they are now. I always feel like there's certain benchmark movies that come along that raise everybody's expectations, and Dark Knight was one of those movies. Avengers was one of those movies. Captain America Civil War was one of those movies. Every time one of these good ones comes along, people are like, oh shit, superhero movies need to be this good or better now. But I will say Spider-Man Homecoming, definitely better than Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2, definitely better than Spider-Man 3. Whether or not it's better than 1 and 2, I'd have to revisit to know. But right now I'm leaning towards saying yes, it is better than the Sam Raimi ones. But I would have to watch this again to be sure. We've had a big year so far. We had Logan over at Fox. We had Wonder Woman over at Warner Brothers. We had Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 over at Disney. And we got Thor Ragnarok on the way, as well as Justice League. I mean, it's a huge year for superhero flicks. And I would say this is probably in the same neighborhood as Ant-Man. I'd say it's better than Doctor Strange, but not as good as a standalone superhero movie like, say, Captain America Winter Soldier. Like, if you're just looking at solo movies, I think Captain America Winter Soldier is probably the best solo movie that Marvel's made. Although, technically, Captain America Civil War is also a solo movie, but they obviously pretty much put everybody from the Marvel Universe in there, so I always think of it as more of an Avengers movie. Yeah, so it's better than the average Marvel flicks. Definitely better than the 2 Thor flicks. I'd say it's better than the first Captain America movie. But this is obviously very, very subjective. Everybody has their different order on how they rank things. So my favorite Marvel movies are Captain America Civil War, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1, and Captain America Winter Soldier. I think those are the 3 best they've made to date. But I obviously have high hopes for Thor Ragnarok and Black Panther and all that cool shit they have coming our way. And I have a feeling Avengers Infinity War will be fucking incredible because the Russo brothers, who did Winter Soldier and Captain America Civil War, they're at the top of their game right now and delivering astonishing work, and I think they're 2 of the best directors in the business for this kind of material. At this point, we have so many options when it comes to superhero shows and movies. Like, we're at the point now where we have so many that we can afford to be kind of blasé. Well, I'm not going to watch those shows. I'm not going to watch those movies. I'm just going to focus on these. Like, back in the day, in the 80s, if you were a comic book fan, you watched everything because there was just very little to choose from. But now it's like, well, I'm not going to watch the Flash TV show. I'm just going to watch Flash in the Warner Brothers movies. Or I'm not going to watch Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I'm just going to watch the Marvel Cinematic Universe on the big screen. Like, it's a wonderful privilege to have to be able to make those choices about which ones we want to focus on. I mean, even something like The Defenders coming out in August on Netflix has the potential to be cooler than a lot of superhero movies, which is all a long way of saying that it's hard for a superhero movie now to really stand out and be a breakaway, runaway success because we're very, very used to getting good, solid stuff and or better on a regular basis. I mean, movies like Logan, movies like Logan are a game changer. And as soon as you see Logan and you see him stabbing claws through people's faces and Laura shredding people to pieces, you're like, oh, superhero movies can do that? More of that, please. So it's hard to stay relevant when you've got all these game-changing movies coming along. In any case, I've been rambling enough at this point. Time to wrap this video up. thank you so much for watching. Hope you'll consider giving my channel a subscribe. Give me a shout on Twitter at Colbrax if you want to talk more. Have a great weekend at the movies, and I'll be back on Sunday for some more Twin Peaks and next week for Planet of the Apes. So lots of good stuff on the horizon, lots of videos that I want to make, and I'll talk to y'all soon. So long.